The dust settled on her like a second skin, a fine grit that filled the folds of her dress and the creases at her eyes. She did not brush it away. Her hands rested in her lap, palms up and empty, as if she were waiting to receive a penance that had not yet been named. She sat on a shipping crate at the edge of the platform, a piece of forgotten luggage left behind by a train that had already bled its smoke into the vast, indifferent sky. The sun was a merciless hammer, beating down on the raw timber of the station and the splintered planks of the boardwalk. It bleached the color from the world, leaving everything in shades of bone and straw. Her bare feet, tucked beneath the ragged hem of her skirt, were numb to the heat of the wood. She had been sitting for a long time, so long that the townspeople had passed through all the stages of their curiosity. First, there had been the stares, sharp and pointed as new nails. Women in crisp calico dresses, clutching Bibles and shopping baskets, had pulled their children closer, their whispers like the rustle of dry leaves. Men in dusty hats had paused on their way out of the saloon, their eyes lingering with a mixture of pity and a low, ugly appraisal. She was a curiosity, a problem that did not yet belong to anyone. Then, the murmurs had given way to a kind of dull acceptance. She became a fixture like the water trough or the hitching post. The station master, a man with a face like a worn-out boot, had come out twice. The first time, he had asked her a question she did not answer. The second, he had just stood there, scratching the back of his neck, his frustration a sour smell on the air. He had a telegram in his hand, a flimsy yellow rectangle that held the sum of her worth. Rejected, unwanted, returned to sender if only there were a place to send her. She did not cry. The place inside her where tears were made had long since dried up, leaving behind a salty, barren landscape. She kept her gaze fixed on a crack in the platform boards, a dark line that seemed to stretch on into eternity. She had learned that if you did not look at them, you could almost believe they were not there. You could almost believe you were not there either. You could shrink yourself down, smaller and smaller, until you were just a mote of dust, ready to be carried away on the next gust of wind. The wind was a constant companion, hot and abrasive, carrying the scent of sagebrush and failure. It lifted a strand of her lank, pale hair and whipped it across her face. She did not move to tuck it back. Elias watched from the shade of the mercantile's awning. He had come to town for salt and flour, a trip he made only when necessity outweighed his distaste for the clatter and chatter of other people. He had seen her the moment he rode in, a still point in the town's restless motion. He saw the way the light caught the pale line of her jaw, the rigid set of her shoulders. He saw the townsfolk look and then look away, their judgment as plain as the signs hanging over their shops. He carried whole winters in his eyes, the memory of loss a permanent frost around the edges. He knew what it was to be alone in a crowd. He watched the station master come out again, this time with a man whose face was florid with drink and self-importance. Garrison, the man who had sent for her. His voice was loud, a booming pronouncement for all to hear. I said no. Look at her. Thin as a fence rail and twice as plain. That's not what was promised. The station master wrung his hands. Mr. Garrison, the passage was paid for. You have to. I don't have to do a thing. Garrison sneered, spitting a brown stream of tobacco juice that landed dangerously close to her bare foot. She did not flinch. Send her back. There's no sending her back. The line won't take her without fare. Garrison laughed, a harsh, grating sound. Then she's your problem, he turned, dismissing her as he would a stray dog, and strode back toward the saloon. Elias felt something shift inside him, a slow, tectonic movement of old, buried principle. It was not anger. Anger was a hot, quick fire, and he had not felt its burn in years. This was different. It was a cold, heavy weight of obligation. He watched the station master approach the woman on the crate, his expression a mix of weary frustration and impending cruelty. He was about to tell her to move on, to become someone else's problem. And in this land, a woman alone was a problem that was solved quickly and without kindness. Elias pushed himself off the wall. His movements were deliberate, economical. He did not hurry. His worn leather duster shifted around him, and the dust from the street puffed up from his boots with each step. The sound of his approach was soft, but the station master heard it and turned, a flicker of hope in his eyes. Perhaps here was a man who would offer a solution. Elias stopped a few feet away, his shadow falling over the woman. He did not look at her directly, not yet. He addressed the station master, his voice low and steady, a sound that seemed to come from under floorboards. "What's the trouble?" "Garrison won't take her," the station master said, gesturing with his thumb. "Refuses. And she's got no fare to go back." Elias's gaze drifted to the crate, to the slight, still figure perched there. He saw the raw, red skin on her wrists, where ropes must have been. He saw the hollows beneath her cheekbones. He saw the utter absence in her eyes, a void where a person used to be. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a few coins. They were not much, but they were more than the cost of a telegram. He held them out to the station master. "This will cover her fare if she wants to take it. And your trouble." The station master looked at the coins, then at Elias, then at the woman. "And if she doesn't?" Elias's gaze finally met hers. It was like looking into a deep, still well. He expected to see fear, or hope, or defiance. He saw nothing, just a quiet, waiting emptiness. "Then I'll take her," he said. The words hung in the hot, silent air. It was not a proposal. It was a statement of fact, as simple and unadorned as the landscape around them. He was not buying her. He was ending the spectacle. The station master snatched the coins, his relief palpable. "She's yours." He scurried back into the cool darkness of his office. The matter closed. Elias remained standing in the sun. He looked at the woman. He had claimed her, but she was still bound to that crate by an invisible tether of shame and exhaustion. He did not offer a hand. He did not speak. He simply turned and walked toward his horse, which stood patiently at the hitching post. He untied the reins, expecting her to follow. She did not move. He waited. The sun beat down. A dog barked somewhere down the street. He understood. It was not enough to be claimed. You had to be released. He walked back to her, his steps slow. He knelt, not too close, and drew a small, sharp knife from his belt. On the side of the crate, coiled like a sleeping snake, was a length of coarse rope. It was what they had used to secure her to the wagon that brought her from some even more desolate stop up the line. He reached out and, with one clean slice, severed it. The rope fell to the planks with a soft thud. He sheathed the knife and stood up. He did not wait for thanks. He just walked back to his horse and swung himself into the saddle. He nudged the animal into a slow, plodding walk, heading out of town, away from the watching eyes and whispering mouths. For a long moment, there was no sound behind him. Then he heard it, the soft, hesitant scuff of bare feet on dusty ground. She was following. The journey was a long, silent procession. Elias kept the horse at a walk, a pace a person on foot could match without struggle. The sun moved across the sky, a relentless eye tracking their slow progress across the cracked, thirsty earth. The dust lifted behind them like ghosts of all the words they did not speak. He did not look back. He could feel her presence behind him, a faint disturbance in the air. He listened to the rhythm of her footsteps, sometimes steady, sometimes faltering on the uneven ground. Twice he stopped. The first time, he dismounted and unhooked his canteen. He drank, then held it out to her, his arm outstretched, his gaze fixed on the horizon. She stopped a few paces away. Her eyes, shadowed and wary, flickered from the canteen to his face and back again. He saw the flicker of thirst, the dry parting of her lips. For a long moment, she did not move. He did not press her. He simply held it, an offering without demand. Finally, her hand, trembling slightly, reached out and took it. Her fingers were cold against his. She drank, her throat working, and handed it back. He nodded once, a barely perceptible motion, and they continued on. The second time he stopped, The sun was a blood-orange smear against the western hills, and the land was cast in long, distorted shadows. They were in the low foothills now, the air cooler, the scent of pine sharp and clean. He swung down from the saddle and looked at her. The last light caught the weariness etched on her face, the way her dress, thin as a moth's wing, clung to her frame. "We camp here," he said. The words felt loud in the vast quiet. He built a small fire, his movements practiced and efficient. He laid out his bedroll on one side and a spare, worn blanket on the other. He said nothing about it. He cooked a small portion of bacon and 2 flat, dense biscuits over the flames. He put half on a tin plate and set it near her blanket, then retreated to his own side of the fire. She ate. He could see her silhouette against the flickering light, her movements small and precise as she broke the biscuit and ate the bacon. When she was done, she set the plate down and drew the blanket around her shoulders, curling into a tight ball, facing away from him. Elias stared into the flames, feeding them small sticks, watching the sparks spiral up into the immense, star-dusted darkness. He was a man who had made a home out of solitude, and he had just invited a stranger into its heart. He did not know her name. He did not know her story. He only knew the hollowed-out look in her eyes, a look he recognized from his own reflection in a dark windowpane. The fire crackled. The wind soughed in the pines. He kept watch until the sky began to gray in the east, and he saw that the tight knot of her body had, at some point in the night, finally relaxed into sleep. They reached his homestead late the next day. The house was not much, a simple cabin of hewn logs chinked with mud and time. It stood alone in a small clearing, backed by a stand of tall pines, looking out over a valley that fell away in shades of brown and green. It was a place that had been carved out of the wilderness by stubbornness and sweat, a place built for 2 that now held only 1. A single, neat grave lay under a gnarled oak tree a short distance from the house. It was marked by a simple wooden cross, weathered to a soft silver. He led the horse to the trough, and she stopped near the porch steps, her hands twisting in the fabric of her dress. She was looking at the grave. Elias said nothing. He unsaddled the horse, his movements methodical, giving her time to absorb the stark reality of the place. It was isolated. It was weather-beaten. It was haunted. When he was done, he walked to the cabin door and pushed it open, creaked on its leather hinges. He stepped inside and turned, holding the door for her. It was an invitation. The inside was spare and clean. A stone hearth dominated one wall, cold and dark. There was a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a shelf with a few books and a collection of smooth stones, and a bed built into one corner. In the opposite corner was a smaller cot, neatly made. He gestured toward the cot. "You can sleep there," he pointed to a pump in the corner. Water. He walked to a wooden chest at the foot of his own bed and lifted the lid. He pulled out a pair of his late wife's old work boots and a simple homespun dress, clean but faded. He set them on the cot. These should fit. He did not want her to feel indebted. He wanted her to feel safe. He looked at the heavy bar leaning against the wall next to the door. He picked it up and deliberately set it on the floor, far from the latch. "I don't lock doors," he said, his voice quiet. Then he turned and walked back outside, leaving her alone in the sudden silence of the house. He needed to mend a fence. The work was there, waiting. It always was. It was how he measured his days, how he kept the ghosts at bay. He hoped it might work for her, too. The days settled into a rhythm, as quiet and steady as a slow heartbeat. They moved around each other in the small space of the cabin and the larger space of the land, 2 planets in a silent orbit. A routine was built not with words, but with the shared necessities of survival. He rose before the sun, starting the fire in the hearth. By the time she emerged from the cot, the chill was off the room. She would already be dressed in the faded gray dress, her pale hair braided neatly down her back. The boots were too big, but she wore them. He would go out to tend the animals, a single milk cow and a handful of chickens, and work the land. He mended harnesses, cleared stones from the small vegetable patch, and split wood until his shoulders ached with a familiar, grounding pain. He was stitching his life back together, one chore at a time. She took over the space inside the house. In the beginning, her movements were tentative, as if she were afraid of leaving a mark. She swept the floorboards with a twig broom, her strokes soundless. She washed their 2 plates, their 2 forks, their 2 cups. She learned the quirks of the wood stove, the way it needed to be coaxed and fed just so. He would come in from the fields, tired and covered in the day's dirt, and find a plate of food on the table. It was often simple, stew or beans with bread, but it was always warm. They ate in silence. The only sounds the scrape of forks on tin and the crackle of the fire. The silence was not empty. It was a wide, open space where they could exist without the need for explanation or justification. It was a balm. The first small change came a week in. Elias returned to the cabin to find the windows, usually cloudy with grime, had been washed clean. The afternoon light poured in, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. It made the room feel larger, less like a tomb. He said nothing, but he noticed. The next day, she started a small garden near the porch steps. She used a broken trowel she had found near the barn, her hands, unused to the labor, quickly becoming chapped and sore. He watched her from a distance, saw her wince as she worked the hard soil. That evening, he left a tin of salve on the table next to her plate. When he woke the next morning, the trowel was gone from where she had left it. In its place was the one he used, its wooden handle smoothed and oiled, its blade sharpened to a fine edge. One afternoon, as he was returning from the far pasture, he saw her standing by the grave under the oak tree. In her hand was a small, defiant cluster of purple wildflowers. She knelt, her movements full of a quiet grace, and cleared away a few stray leaves from the base of the wooden cross. She carefully placed the flowers there, a splash of color against the weathered gray wood. She stayed there for a long time, her head bowed. Elias stopped, hidden by the corner of the barn, and felt a thawing in a part of his chest that had been frozen solid for years. He was not just sharing his home with her. She was beginning to tend its sorrows. That night, the silence at dinner felt different. It was softer, less brittle. He found himself speaking, the words surprising him as much as her. "The bread," he said, looking at the dense, slightly burned loaf on the cutting board. "It's a little dry." She looked up, her eyes wide. It was the first time he had offered anything close to a criticism. A faint flush rose on her cheeks. "You didn't complain about mine," he added, his voice low. His own bread was notoriously tough, a running joke he'd only ever had with himself. A flicker of something moved across her face. It was not quite a smile, but it was close. A small, upward twitch at the corner of her mouth. "That loaf died in vain," she whispered. Her voice was thin from disuse, like a rusty hinge, but it was clear. He felt the corner of his own mouth lift in response. This one put up a fight. The moment passed. They finished their meal in their usual quiet. But something had been built in that brief exchange, a small bridge across the chasm of their shared silence. The nightmares started a few nights later. He was woken by a sound, a sharp, choked gasp from the other side of the room. He lay still, listening. It was followed by a frantic thrashing, the sound of the blanket being fought against as if it were an attacker. "No," she whimpered, a raw, terrified sound. "Don't. Please, don't lock me in." Elias sat up. The fire had burned down to embers, casting the room in deep, shifting shadows. He could just make out her form on the cot, a tense knot of fear. His first instinct was to go to her, to offer a comforting hand. But he stopped himself. Touch, for her, was likely a currency of pain and control. He would not use it, not even in kindness. Instead, he rose quietly and added a few logs to the fire. The flames caught, pushing back the darkness, filling the cabin with a warm, steady light. He did not go back to bed. He pulled one of the chairs close to the hearth and sat, his back to her, a silent, watchful guardian. He picked up a piece of wood and his whittling knife and began to carve, the soft scrape of the blade a steady, rhythmic sound in the night. He did not know what he was making. He was just making a sound that was not fear. He sat there until the first hint of dawn touched the clean windows. The sounds from the cot had long since quieted. When he finally looked over, she was awake, watching him. Her eyes were wide and dark in the pale morning light, but the terror was gone. In its place was a question. He set down his carving. It had taken the shape of a small, rough-hewn bird. He stood, stretched his stiff back, and began the morning routine of making coffee. As he stood by the stove, her voice, small but steady, came from across the room. "Why?" she asked. It was not about the fire or the chair or the long night's vigil. It was the question that had been sitting between them since the station platform. "Why did you take me?" Elias looked out the window at the land, his land, which demanded so much and gave back just enough. He thought of the long, empty evenings, the silence that was not peaceful but hollow. He thought of the single grave under the oak tree. "Needed the help," he said, his voice rough. He paused, feeling the inadequacy of the words. He turned to look at her. And it seemed the right thing to do. She held his gaze for a long moment, searching his face. She seemed to find what she was looking for. She gave a single, slow nod. The unspoken contract between them, forged in silence and shared labor, had finally been given a voice. It was enough. Life on the homestead found its footing. The small garden she had started began to yield green shoots, tender and hopeful. Her humming, at first a barely audible whisper, became a soft, constant presence in the cabin as she worked. She mended his worn shirts with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. He, in turn, fixed the loose step on the porch and resoled her worn-out boots with a new layer of thick leather. They were building a life, not from grand declarations, but from 1,000 tiny acts of care. The community, however, had a long memory. When Elias went to town for supplies, he felt their eyes on him. The whispers followed him from the mercantile to the blacksmith. He was the quiet widower who had brought home the discarded woman. They saw scandal. They saw foolishness. He saw only the neat list of goods she had written out for him in a surprisingly elegant script. One day, a neighbor from the next valley over, a man named Henderson with more curiosity than sense, rode up to their fence line. Elias was digging post holes, his back slick with sweat. The woman, he still did not know her name, was hanging laundry on a line strung between two pines. "Elias," Henderson called out, his voice oily with false friendliness. "Heard you got yourself some help." His eyes slid over to her, a lingering, unpleasant gaze. Elias straightened up slowly, his hands tightening on the handle of the post-hole digger. "I did. Garrison's telling folks she's his." Henderson pressed, enjoying himself. "Says you stole her." The woman froze, her hands still clutching a wet sheet. The color drained from her face, leaving it as pale as the laundry. Elias took a slow step forward, planting the digger in the soft earth. His voice, when he spoke, was dangerously quiet. "Garrison is a man who talks too much, and you're a man who listens too much. Now get off my land." Henderson's smile faltered. He looked from Elias's cold, hard eyes to the woman, who was now staring at him with a defiance he had not expected. He muttered something under his breath and wheeled his horse around, kicking up dust as he retreated. Elias watched him go. He turned and saw her still standing by the line, trembling. He walked over to her. "You're either the kindest man I've ever met," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "or the most foolish." He stopped in front of her. "Can't I be both?" For the first time, a true smile touched her lips. It was a fragile, beautiful thing, like a wildflower blooming in rock. "I suppose you can." She looked down at her hands. "My name is Lena." He nodded slowly, testing the name in the quiet of his mind. Lena suited her. It had strength and softness in it. "Elias," he said, giving her his own name in return. Felt like a fair trade. The peace, once named, seemed to deepen. But the world outside their small sanctuary had not forgotten them. The harbinger arrived not as a rider on the horizon, but as a flicker of orange against the dark line of the distant hills. A fire. It was too far south to be a threat to them, but it was on Garrison's grazing land. It was a sign. A man like Garrison, when his pride was wounded, did not simply let things go. He let them fester, and then he acted. A few days later, they saw the riders. 3 of them coming up the valley road. They moved with a purpose that was not friendly. Elias was chopping wood near the barn. Lena was on the porch, shelling peas into a large wooden bowl. She saw them first. The rhythmic thud of the axe stopped. Elias looked up, following her gaze. He saw the riders, and his face hardened into a mask of grim resolve. He set the axe down gently, deliberately, and walked toward the house. "Lena," he said, his voice calm, "go inside. Stay away from the window." She looked from the approaching riders to his face. The fear was there, a cold shadow in her eyes. But underneath it was something else, something new, a hard-won resilience. She clutched the bowl of peas to her chest like a shield. "No," she said. Her voice did not tremble. He looked at her, surprised. He saw the set of her jaw, the straight line of her back. He saw a woman who was done with being hidden, done with being scared. He gave a single, sharp nod of understanding and respect. He turned to face the riders, and she stood on the porch behind him, a silent partner in whatever was to come. Garrison reined in his horse a few yards from the porch, his 2 companions fanning out on either side of him. His face was blotchy with anger and the midday sun. He looked past Elias, his eyes fixing on Lena. "I've come for my property," Garrison said, his voice loud and carrying. He made the word property sound like an obscenity. Elias stood with his feet planted firmly on the earth of his home. He did not raise his voice. He did not reach for a weapon. His stillness was its own kind of force. "She is not your property," Elias said. "She never was. You refused her." "I paid her passage," Garrison spat. "That makes her mine. The law is on my side. I have a contract." He held up a piece of paper, waving it like a flag of conquest. "That paper means nothing here," Elias said. "This is my land, and she is under my protection." Garrison laughed, a humorless bark. "Your protection? You're one man, old-timer. A sad widower playing homesteader. I have 2 men here who disagree, and the law in my pocket." One of Garrison's men, a lanky youth with cruel eyes, started to dismount, a rope coiled in his hand. It was then that Lena moved. She did not scream or run. She took 1 step forward, to the edge of the porch, so she was standing level with Elias's shoulder. She held the wooden bowl in one hand. Her eyes, clear and cold as a winter sky, locked onto Garrison's. "I am not property," she said. The words were not loud, but they cut through the tense air with the sharpness of glass. "I am a person, and I choose to be here." Garrison's face contorted in disbelief, then rage. That she, this discarded thing, would dare to speak, to choose. "You don't have a choice," he roared, and spurred his horse forward, reaching for her. Elias moved like lightning. He did not step back. He stepped forward, into the path of the horse, grabbing the bridle with one powerful hand, forcing the animal's head down and around. The horse shied, whinnying in protest. In the same motion, Elias's other hand shot out and grabbed Garrison's arm, his grip like iron. "You will not touch her," Elias snarled, his voice a low growl that was more terrifying than any shout. For the first time, the men saw the winter in his eyes, and it was not grief. It was a killing frost. But the fight was not just his anymore. As Garrison struggled against Elias's grip, Lena acted. With a swift, fluid motion, she raised the heavy wooden bowl and brought it down hard on Garrison's outstretched hand. The crack of wood against bone was sharp and ugly. Garrison howled, snatching his hand back. He stared at it, then at Lena, his face a mask of shocked fury. She did not flinch. She stood her ground, the bowl held ready, her expression fierce and unyielding. She was no longer a victim. She was a defender of her own life, of her own home. The two men with Garrison looked at each other, their bravado gone. They had come for an easy prize, to intimidate a lone woman and a quiet farmer. They had not bargained for this. They had not bargained for two people standing as one, unmovable and unbroken. They saw the look in Elias's eyes and the fire in Lena's, and they saw a fight they could not win. Garrison, clutching his injured hand, glared at them, his face purple with rage. "What are you waiting for?" But his men did not move. The youth who had started to dismount slowly swung his leg back over his saddle. The other just shook his head. Defeated not by force of arms but by sheer force of will, Garrison yanked his horse's reins, wheeling the animal around so violently it stumbled. "This isn't over!" he screamed back at them, a hollow, impotent threat. They watched as the three riders retreated down the valley road, their haste a clear signal of their defeat. They did not look back. The dust settled. The silence that rushed in to fill the space was profound. The world seemed to hold its breath. Elias slowly released his grip on the horse bridle that was no longer there. His hands were shaking. He turned and looked at Lena. She was still standing on the porch, the wooden bowl held tight in her hands. A single green pea had fallen and lay on the dusty planks at her feet. She looked at him, her eyes wide with the aftermath of fear and adrenaline. "I was scared," she said, her voice trembling now that the danger was past. "I know," he said softly. He took a step toward her onto the porch. "You didn't run." "Neither did you," she replied. He reached out not to touch her, but to take the heavy bowl from her hands. His fingers brushed against hers. It was the first time they had touched since he had given her the canteen on the road. This time her skin was not cold. It was warm with life. He set the bowl down on the railing. He looked at her, at the woman who had faced down her own demon and won. The woman who had given him a reason to do the same. In the quiet that followed, a new contract was forged, not of safety for service, but of something far deeper. He saw it in her eyes and she saw it in his. He had not rescued her. They had, in standing together, rescued each other. The house behind them was no longer just his shelter or her sanctuary. It was their fortress. It was their home. That evening, after the chores were done and the sun had set, they sat by the fire. The air between them was different, charged with the unsaid things, with the truth of the day. Elias took the small wooden bird he had carved the night of her nightmare and, with the tip of his knife, carefully etched the letter L onto its base. He sanded it smooth with his thumb and held it out to her. She took it, her fingers tracing the curve of the wood, the sharp line of the initial. It was a gift. It was a promise. It was an acknowledgement of everything she was. She looked up at him, her eyes shining in the firelight. "Elias," she began, her voice thick with emotion, but she did not need to finish. He understood. He reached into the fire, his hand wrapped in a thick rag, and pulled out a small, charred object. It was the tattered, flimsy contract Garrison had waved in the air before dropping it in his hasty retreat. Elias had picked it up after they were gone. He held it out over the flames until it caught, curling into a black, brittle scroll. He let the ashes fall into the hearth, where they disintegrated into nothing. The past was gone. The claim was void. A few days later, they walked together to the fence line that Garrison's horse had damaged. Without a word, they began to repair it. He dug the new post hole, his movements strong and sure. She cleared the broken rails and brought him the new ones, her steps light and confident on the land she now knew as her own. They worked together, their movements falling into a familiar, comfortable rhythm, rebuilding the boundary that protected their world. The final image was not one of grand romance, but of quiet, profound peace. Months had passed. The first snow of winter lay like a clean, soft blanket on the valley. Inside the cabin, the fire burned bright and steady. The house, which had once felt haunted by absence, now breathed with life. A pot of stew simmered on the hearth, filling the room with the scent of time and warmth. Elias sat in his chair, mending a leather harness, his hands steady and sure. Lena sat in the other chair, a book open in her lap, her head tilted as she read aloud. Her voice, once thin and hesitant, was now rich and clear, a warm current in the quiet room. He was not listening to the words of the story. He was listening to the sound of her voice, the sound of his life beginning again. He looked up, and she paused, her eyes meeting his over the top of the book. She smiled, a real and easy smile that reached all the way to her eyes. He smiled back. Nothing needed to be said. They had stitched their lives together with the raw, strong thread of shared silence, of quiet kindness, of standing firm when the wind turned mean. They had found their home not on a map, but in each other. This story, it ain't just about a rescue at a dusty train station. It's about the fact that sometimes the most broken things can be put back together, not by being fixed but by being seen. It's about how real strength isn't about the noise you make, but about the ground you refuse to give up. We all have a piece of us that's been left on a platform somewhere, feeling worthless and unclaimed. We all have a quiet, empty homestead in our hearts, haunted by the ghosts of what we've lost. The world will tell you that you need a grand gesture, a loud declaration, a hero on a white horse. But this story knows better. It knows healing starts with a shared meal in silence. It knows love can be spelled out in a sharpened tool, a wildflower on a grave, a warm fire on a cold night. So here's your naming, a reminder that you are not property. You are not a problem to be solved. You are a person with a choice. And if you're brave enough to stand your ground, if you're quiet enough to listen for the sound of another lonely soul trying to mend a fence in the wilderness, you might just find that the thing you thought was an ending was really just the journey home.